and welcome. I'm Deb Cowen. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and we're here for this incredibly momentous event, the launch of Bryan Palmer's extraordinary 3-volume history of colonialism and capitalism in Canada, or what Professor Hagwell Hayes of UBC and the Gixala Nation has called a detailed tour de force. Yeah, 3 volumes. We have an incredible evening ahead, first and foremost because we are celebrating and engaging the gift of this labor of love and study. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you also to Joan, and all who helped make these books possible. I also want to thank Matt and all the folks at the Leo Panitch School for bringing us together tonight. But we also have an incredible evening ahead because this powerhouse of a panel of very big, brilliant thinkers and doers. Before I go on to introduce the panel, I want to invite us all to infuse this space with the beautiful spirit you each carried here tonight that I felt in talking with you and in the lobby and so forth. So I want to ask you to each take a very quick look into your neighbor's eyes, and with just your eyes, so no, you don't have to say anything, just communicate something like hello, good to see you, and maybe even like how lucky we are to be here tonight together. So, okay, fantastic, thank you. Okay, so we're gathered on the lands of, that was more titillating than I thought it would be. Okay, so we're gathered here on the lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat peoples, and the treaty territories of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This is, of course, an exquisite place animated by extraordinary solidarity and creativity, as this panel already suggests, but it's also a settler colony, even as the term settler colony might be troubled a little bit by our author, where the ravages of capitalism, the violence and dispossession of Indigenous life and land unfold in real time, and where anti-Black racism and the uneven vulnerabilities to premature death are laid bare. And we gather, of course, at a critical conjuncture. The world is on fire. This place called Canada is on fire, and I hear Lytton is on fire again from Russ. Both near and far we see and live, and from the scintillating little exchanges you all just had in this room, we also resist and refuse the intensification of genocide, extractivism, dispossession, and militarism in all its profoundly gendered, racialized, and classed materiality. Bryan's brave books tackle the long histories of imperial violence that have gotten us to this place, that have made this place the entangled workings of capitalism and colonialism. But of course, as I've already suggested, we're also in a place and time that's defined by the courage and beauty of movements for change. We only need to note that this is the eve of Indigenous Peoples Day and the 3rd week of Indigenous History Month, the weekend of Juneteenth, and the ever-expanding marathon of LGBTQ2SI Pride, among other markers, to remind us that our here and now also inherits traditions, infrastructures, and victories of creative struggle and otherwise world-making. Bryan's books are also incredibly helpful here. Again, I quote Professor Hayes, who suggests that, quote, Palmer's work is critical in the sense of being important, as in providing clarity for social change action. Indeed, in offering this account, simultaneously history and geography, I'm a geographer, so I'm going to insist Bryan's also a fabulous geographer, for what is the making of Canada, if not the attempted replacement of vibrant multinational Indigenous territories through the ongoing and contested assertion of jurisdiction of a capitalist and colonial nation state. Bryan makes the land itself a main character in this trilogy. No doubt, while Bryan's books are concerned with the past, it may well be that their greatest gift lies in renewed visions that they offer for paths forward. The certainty of capitalism and colonialism's long and entangled past, and the solidarities, alliances, and coalitions that are required for building a different future. In a discussion of these works, Bryan quotes Guyanese novelist and playwright Jan Carew, who insists, quote, in analyzing race relations in this country, it is impossible to deal with the Black minority without reference to the Indian one. The two are indivisible, since racism springs from the same taproot in society, a history of exploitation and greed, where profits were more important than human rights. The Blacks and Indians were dispossessed for the same reasons, end quote. The very DNA of these books lie in the promise of solidarity and reciprocity, Bryan begins book one with that very spirit and commitment, a respectful engagement with the dish with one spoon, the pre-colonial indigenous treaty that Leanne Simpson, Anishinaabe writer, musician, and scholar, describes as an agreement about how nations will, quote, share the land, maintain their own sovereignty, and care for the territory together, end quote. However, Bryan also draws our attention to its resonances with socialist and communist visions, and I quote him quoting, an injury to one is an injury to all. This truly was the corollary of the bowl with one spoon. Anti-colonialist commitment, he argues, if wedded to anti-capitalism, would have only extended and fulfilled labor's original organizing principle. This dazzling account of the past gives us an inspired map of possible futures. So with that, I want to get us into the real meat, or tofu, or tempeh, as you prefer, of this special occasion. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes. About 10 minutes? Yes. So we begin with Russ Diabo. Russ Diabo is a highly respected policy analyst and advocate with decades of experience championing Indigenous rights and sovereignty in Canada. A member of the Kahnawake Mohawk Nation, Russ has specialized expertise in federal policies, legislation, and processes impacting First Nations, among many other beautiful talents and achievements. I'll hand it over to you, Russ.
Bryan contacted me by email asking me if I'd review his books, and I didn't respond to him for a long time. I think it was months, and I was a little apprehensive because, you know, I've seen other books on Canada's history that you know, weren't very fair to Indigenous peoples. I finally answered him and said yes, I'll look at them. So he had the book sent to me. And again, it took me a while because I've been working on other things. It took me a while. I did scan the first 2 volumes, but I did read volume 3 cover to cover. And I think he's done an excellent job of linking capitalism to colonialism. I went to Trent too as a student, and I was just saying to Deb, I think the first book I read in Canadian studies, because I did take courses in that, was about the fur trade, Harold Innis's book. And that was, you know, basically the beginning of Canadian identity, so that's how come they assigned that book to read. So I'm glad to see this book, which is much more comprehensive, going from the point of contact until now. And I just wanted to give my perspective on that. I use the term Indian. I know some people don't like using it, but I use it because I noticed Bryan went through a whole thing about vocabulary in his book, and what should we call these people. And he did kind of settle on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. But I use the word Indian now because that has a historical, legal, and political meaning. That's what I grew up with, was the term Indians. We still have the Indian Act. So I want to kind of give my abbreviated version of Canada's history. First of all, at European contact, which this book goes back to the 1500s, to European contact, before Europeans arrived in what's called by anthropologists the northeastern woodlands, Indigenous nations were making treaties between each other using wampum belts. And wampum belts are memory devices that are read. There's an oral history and a tradition that's taught in how you read a belt. And that's handed down generation to generation. So that was going on way before any European ships sailed over here. But for the Haudenosaunee peoples, my ancestors, the first treaty was with the Dutch up around the Hudson River and around where New York City is now. That treaty was in a wampum belt called the two-row wampum. And it has two, you may have seen it, two long purple lines with a white line in the middle to symbolize the ships traveling side by side through the river of life or the river of time. And the agreement was that we would be like brothers, not father and son. We would be equals, and we wouldn't try to steer the other's vessel, the ship, or the canoe. The Dutch were pushed out pretty early on, and the British took over that role. And that two-row wampum became known as the covenant chain relationship, often symbolized by a ship tied to a tree. And then later on it became symbolized by a chain, a silver chain, because that relationship was seen to have to be polished from time to time like silver, it tarnishes. So it was to be renewed, and there would be meetings between British representatives and Haudenosaunee people. That's how the treaty-making process started with the Haudenosaunee. And the European nations, as they came, the French came, and the British, they wanted us as partners for trade and military alliance, particularly since the French and the English were competing for control to treaty with us, but also to do fur trade and to explore what's become North America. And that relationship evolved over time. The French and the English had their conflict. In 1760, where I come from, there was a Treaty of Oswegatchie, and that was with the Seven Nations Confederacy, which were basically around the island of Montreal. Those are basically the communities where missions had been set up by the Jesuits. And those communities, including my community, Kahnawake, became allies of the French. And Kahnawake actually had been warned a few times by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that they were too close to the French, and they threatened to burn Kahnawake down, the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, well, Five Nations, which became Six Nations. So in 1760, there was a Treaty of Oswegatchie over by where Cornwall is on the St. Lawrence River. Sir William Johnson, who was the representative of the British Crown at the time, I guess you could say he was the ambassador to the Indian Nations, he asked the Seven Nations Confederacy to remain neutral because they wanted to march on Montreal in the summer of 1760, to defeat them. And they didn't want to have to fight the Indian Nations at the same time as they were fighting the French. Because at that time, the Indian Nations controlled the waterways, which were the highways, like the St. Lawrence River, the Ottawa River. And so they agreed to remain neutral in that Treaty of Oswegatchie, and that was in the spring of 1760. The French were defeated in the summer, and in October of 1760, there was a Treaty of Kahnawake. And that's where the former French allies, the Seven Nations Confederacy, agreed to be friends of the British and allies. And of course, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy already were in that situation, so that covenant chain relationship was extended in the east to the Seven Nations Confederacy and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And Pontiac, who was Nadawa, he was a French ally too, he didn't trust the British. And he burned down 10 of the 12 forts after that in the Great Lakes. And that made the British very nervous. So King George III, it's argued that that's why King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, because it focused a lot on trespass, and it recognized Indian territory. It recognized different zones. It recognized, the 13 colonies. It recognized the colony of Quebec, because, of course, they'd been defeated. And it recognized Rupert's Land. So King George generously gave it to the Hudson's Bay Company, and that was most of modern-day Canada. And, the Indian nations were still considered important allies for military trade reasons. And when the American settlers started to agitate against Britain, and you get the American Revolution happening, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy couldn't decide. There was arguments between the different nations on what to do. Should they fight with the Americans? Should they fight with the British? They were divided because some were close to the Americans, some were close to the British. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy said they would remain neutral. And they said, you know, to all the warriors, you know, when you fight on the ground, just don't kill each other. You know, just the whites. And so some fought with the Americans and some fought with the British. And after the American Revolution, you know, that's where the Americans started to develop their own Indian policy. I think it was 1798 was the first non-intercourse act where the Americans started to develop their own policy because they didn't have the British experience to teach them, so they had to kind of make it up. But on the Canadian side, there were allies of the British, you know, going back to the Treaty of Oswegatchie. And also in 1764, after the Royal Proclamation in Niagara, because Niagara Falls was considered a neutral place for Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, the British held a treaty gathering, and in 1764 they repeated the promises in the Royal Proclamation in what's called the Treaty of Niagara, which is kind of like the mother of all treaties because that really set out the treaty-making process that came later in Canada. And as allies of the British, after the American Revolution, when the Americans were starting to push in going into the War of 1812, Indian allies were the ones who were on the front line fighting. Thousands died fighting the Americans to stop them from coming into southern Ontario or into Quebec, you know, the eastern townships and the Atlantic. And I'd say it was about 1840 that we started to be outnumbered because a lot of the loyalists were fleeing the United States, coming into Canada, and they were wanting to set up farms. People who worked in the military or, you know, were part of the military with the British. And that's when they started making treaties in Ontario. Quebec never made any treaties, though, even though the Royal Proclamation set out the rules that if there was to be any sharing of land, it had to be done through public meetings and treaties. Quebec never did that. That's why there's no treaties in Quebec other than the peace and friendship treaties. There's no land treaties. The only treaty in Quebec is the modern treaty of the James Bay Agreement of 1975. Most of Quebec is like BC, it's Aboriginal title territory of the different Indian nations. It's not talked about much, but that's the way it is. And I notice Bryan covers Quebec in there in his book. But my view of Quebec, you know, when you get to the British North America Act of 1867, which was covered in the volumes, Canada is a settler state. And that British North America Act cemented the white supremacy of the settler state with the French-speaking and English-speaking peoples, which evolved into Quebec and the rest of Canada. That's what it is today. But that's where it started, the division of powers federally and provincially. And instead of us being allies, military and trade allies, we became subjects. So under the British North America Act, Section 91 is federal powers, Section 92 is provincial powers. So federal powers, you know, banks, commerce, international trade, diplomacy. Provincial powers, natural resources, schools, hospitals, municipalities, that kind of thing. There was a division of powers. Section 9124, under federal powers, gives Parliament exclusive legislative authority for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. That's the head of power that was used in 1876 to pass the Indian Act. There was pre-Confederation legislation in Upper and Lower Canada in 1850. All of that was incorporated into the Post-Confederation Indian Act in 1876. And also Canada purchased Rupert's Land. And that's when they started making treaties on the prairies and in northern Ontario. And that's how Canada's expansion happened in terms of territory. But Canada bases its assumed crown sovereignty on the doctrine of discovery. And its territorial integrity is also based on that. And that's what that's why I say Canada is a settler state, because the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of Canada, federally and provincially, are all based on that assertion of the doctrine of discovery. And that's how the treaties were entered into like on the prairies, but then they set up the reserve system, they expanded it. In the east it was a lot older, but as they expanded the reserves after making treaty, and often they didn't keep their promises and create reserves. That became specific claims later. Anyway, Bryan does a good job of documenting all of that in his books. And, you know, there's been a historical injustice that this book's cover. Quebec still denies the rights of Indigenous peoples within Quebec, other than the James Bay Agreement. Certainly with Mohawk people, we know what happened in 1990. That was over land, a land dispute. So this relationship, this treaty relationship, or what has been called nation-to-nation relationship, is one that has, you know, really been very one-sided. Them passing legislation under Section 9124, not just the Indian Act, but other legislation more in contemporary times. It was in 1968, you know, about 100 years after the Indian Act passed, that Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien was his Minister of Indian Affairs. They proposed this 1969 White Paper on Indian Policy to terminate the legal distinctions between Indians and Canadians through a number of different measures, getting rid of reserves, repealing the Indian Act, amending the BNA Act to remove references to Indians, you know, setting up an Indian Claims Commission to buy out claims, land claims, and to end the historic treaties. So there are a number of measures to do that. Chiefs in Canada, you know, fought back against that, and they created organizations. And a lot of the organizations were called unions. Because why? Because the chiefs, the leaders at that time, were working in the lumber industry, mining, and so on. So the Union of BC Indian Chiefs was formed, the Union of Ontario Indians, the Union of Nova Scotia Indians. It was a model that they were familiar with. And of course, Canada was considered management, right? So that's what I found it interesting, the way Bryan juxtaposed the labor chapters and then the Indigenous chapters kind of parallel to each other. And it made sense to me because that's kind of the way that Canada treated Indians. You know, it was like a labor movement, except they had more legal obligations towards Indians, which they often ignored. But there's two letters, one from Chrétien to Trudeau from 1971 and one from a Director General to the Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs when the Indians pushed back against the White Paper. They said there's nothing wrong with the plan. We just need to put it in components because this was all supposed to be done within 5 years. They said we'll just lengthen the time frame and we'll talk about it in components. We won't talk about it as a whole. So they've been implementing the White Paper objectives since really 1969. They haven't changed. What's changed is the rhetoric. Arthur Manuel said Canadian colonialism has 3 phases. Dispossession, followed by dependency, followed by oppression. Because once you fight back against your poverty, then you get court injunctions and the police actions against you. That's how Canada maintains its rule of law. And they use it, you know, whenever there's blockades, like we saw, you know, with the Wet'suwet'en, who are hereditary chiefs and clans. They co-opted our leadership. You know, the CBC just released, you may have seen the media reports. Let me know when my time is almost up. Okay.
I want to interrupt your flow.
So the CBC just got through Freedom of Information on the RCMP spying on Indigenous leaders, First Nations, Métis, you know, in the 1970s. But what they were spying on was the establishment organizations like the National Indian Brotherhood, the Dene, other regional organizations. who were organizing to fight against the white paper, a termination plan. And they were, you know, the establishment ones. They weren't the ones who were really pushing for change, fundamental change. And, you know, they've continued to do that, even now. They claim their thesis, and them aren't. Sherry Pasternak, who's in here, she and I wrote an article when Harper was in power talking about them monitoring what they call hotspots, you know, which were communities who were fighting against resource extraction. And they're still doing that now. They've co-opted organizations like the Assembly of First Nations. Perry Bellegarde, when he was national chief, he entered into agreements with the Trudeau government. They called it reconciliation and nation to nation. But really what they're doing is they're basically, they come up with a plan using the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They're using that as cover to say that they're going to get rid of the Indian Act because it's inconsistent with the UN Declaration. So they passed a law in Canada called the UNDRIP Act, Bill C-15, and there's a national action plan that they had to develop. The Department of Justice developed it. And the plan is to end the Indian Act, Indian reserves, and Indian status with municipal self-government and with modern extinguishment treaties, you know, de facto extinguishment of Aboriginal title and rights. And most of the chiefs across Canada under Trudeau have gone to these recognition and self-determination tables, they call them. They're negotiating under these policies. The inherent right to self-government policy, which Jean Chrétien left behind, which turns bans into municipalities because there's preconditions and negotiations. There's the land claims policies, which were imposed by Pierre Trudeau and Chrétien in 1973. Comprehensive claims for the Aboriginal title claim areas, specific claims for like treaty areas, broken treaties and things like that. And what they call the addition to reserve policy, where you have to get specific claim settlements using your dollars to buy lands and get them added to the reserve. But now they're redesigning the land registry system they have to phase out reserves and move bans into land codes and into self-government arrangements, which is municipal or corporate type status. They've already got 25 self-government agreements across Canada. This is what they're calling reconciliation and nation-to-nation talks. It's really, and they're using ripping off, creating fraud basically. And most grassroots people don't know this because they passed that Bill C-15 during the pandemic when, you know, Indigenous peoples couldn't even hold public meetings for health reasons. So a lot of them don't even know this stuff happened because it was done through Zoom. They negotiated through Zoom and calls, and then they passed the legislation and developed a national action plan, which the national organizations are implementing. They're partners. So I guess I'll just leave it at that don't believe everything you hear about the rhetoric. Canada uses a communication strategy called special words and tactics. There was a public relations firm called Continental Gold and Harris that in the 1980s advised Canada to do that, to control the dialogue and make it appear that they're reasonable and Indigenous peoples are unreasonable. So that's why they come up with these terms like free education or you know, reconciliation or nation to nation. It's to convince the public and our own people that they're being progressive and they're recognizing our rights when exactly the opposite is true. So I'll leave it there. Sorry, I went on too long.
Okay, next up, it is my incredible pleasure. It's the first time I think I've had the opportunity to introduce and welcome my colleague, Professor George Elliott Clarke. Professor Clarke is a U of T professor who has also taught at Duke and Harvard. He was this city's fourth poet laureate and Canada's 7th parliamentary poet laureate. George has been honored with many, many awards. We would be here for a few days if we were to go through them all, but I'll highlight includes the Governor General's Award for Poetry. Please welcome Professor George Elliott Clarke.
I haven't had a chance to read any of the volumes yet, but I did start reading volume 3 today. And I only got as far as the introduction, or actually towards page 60. But on the first page of the introduction, there is a photograph. And the photograph is of students who are protesting in front of the U.S. consulate in Toronto in 1965, being tossed off the sidewalk and into the street by Toronto's finest and so forth. And that photograph struck a chord with me because it was in 1965 in a demonstration in front of the U.S. consulate against the attacks on civil rights protesters in Selma, Alabama, that convinced Burnley Rocky Jones that he had to take a stand on behalf of black people in Canada against racism. The story goes, and you can pick up his autobiography, Burnley Rocky Jones, Revolutionary. By the way, he lived 1942 to 2013. So he tells the story in his memoir about pushing his daughter Tracy in a stroller down University Avenue with his wife Joan, and seeing a group of white young people protesting against racism and segregation in the United States. And Rocky looked at Joan, and Joan looked at Rocky, and they said, "We've got segregation in Nova Scotia. We have racism in Nova Scotia," where Rocky was from. And so then they went over and joined the demonstration led by Students United for Peace Action, SUPA was the name of the group, that was undertaking these protests in front of the U.S. consulate here in Toronto. And that was the birth of Rocky Jones, the revolutionary, who ended up creating many, many organizations, and eventually leading a court action that brought him before the Supreme Court of Canada, where he won his case in 1995, becoming Supreme Court laureate. But there's another aspect to this which I have to share with you, which is that when I was 18 and completely unsure about what I should do after graduating from Queen Elizabeth High School in Halifax, and I mentioned to Jones, I was hanging out at the Joneses' household in Halifax, I mentioned to Joan that, you know, I don't really know what I should do. I think I'll just hang out and be a hippie. Now that was 1978, so it was a bit late for being a hippie. But Joan put her finger in my face, stuck her finger in my face, and she said, "You are going to go to university." And I said, "How? I don't have the money," and I didn't think I was smart enough to go to university. But Joan found a job for me, and then I thought, well, where am I going to go? And then Rocky said, "You're going to go to the University of Waterloo." I said, well, why am I going to go to the University of Waterloo? Because Canada's foremost expert in black history teaches there, Jim Walker. And so I ended up going to Waterloo. Didn't take a single course with Jim, because I was in English, and I was on work terms with English Co-op, and so I never had a chance to actually study with Jim. But we did become friends and so forth, and still are. But the real point of this long anecdote, and I should get to reading some poetry, is I promise to stick within my 10 minutes. So, and I've already used 4. So just let me say then very quickly that the birth of that revolutionary, Rocky Jones, on that street, University Avenue in Toronto in 1965, led him and Joan to basically radicalize, in a very positive way, a whole group of us young black Nova Scotians as we were then, going back 50 years, going back 60 years practically, well, okay, for me, 50 years or so, and to convince us that we should become activists, to convince us that we should go to university, to convince us that we should become intellectuals. And that's extremely important, because you cannot have any real live resistance without having an intelligentsia to support the activists, to do the heavy lifting of reading the history, of understanding the history and communicating that, so that people understand why it is they have to resist, what it is that they are resisting. We just heard a comment on the British North America Act, And of course, Section 91 and Clause 24, dealing with lands, dealing with Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. One of the striking points about Clause 24 is that it's almost at the end of 27 clauses. Before you get to indigenous people, you have lighthouses. Before you get to indigenous people, you have the post office. So the very structure of the BNA Act makes it clear what the government of Canada thought, and I will say still thinks, about indigenous people. And before I get into reading at least one poem, I just want to say that I was struck but not surprised by the news this week that the Carney government, and keep in mind that Carney also can mean someone who's involved in a carnival, so keep that in mind, that the Carney government has watered down the legislation that was before the House of Commons before last year's election about ensuring that there is proper water service to reserves across this country. And excuse the pun, they watered it down. So that's no longer a commitment to actually provide those services. So my response to that, if anyone were to ask me, would be say that not one micro dot, so to speak, of any kind of resource extraction should be performed on indigenous lands unless the government of Canada fulfills that commitment and that human right to ensure that there's proper water services to all of the reserves.
That's right.
And I should get to reading a poem, and it's a big book, and I am offering it for sale, only $20. It's over 400 pages, which means that it's basically 5 cents a page for some of the world's greatest poetry in English. I don't mind saying it because it's true. But I'm going to read you this poem called Recent Transit Through Washington, D.C. And the speaker in the poem is the founder of the African Baptist Association Nova Scotia. His name is Richard Preston. He was an escaped enslaved person, ended up in Nova Scotia in 1816, and ended up building this incredible church association which still exists, and it's now called the African United Baptist Association. And I recently joined it, being baptized on April 9th, 2023. The recent transit through, only 170 years late because the church association was founded in 1853. But anyway, who's counting? The recent transit through Washington, D.C., 1816, in the voice of Richard Preston. Everybody's a fugitive in that city, so clanging be the alarms, clamor of sirens, chimes, with cops eyeing sharpshooters on roofs. Constant loom threats bullseyeing the president. Nervous city, galling city, white marble sluicing blood. Editorials holler war versus England or Spain. Either targets sport for profiteering. Pages imprinted can be like mud, down sucking each forward plod. Cloudy is the tap water. Malaria rises insurgent of the miasma, that's the Potomac. Congress, so many bow-tied mannequins lying straight out their lungs. An injurious winter freezes their postures, prostrate, supine, crucified. Look it! Washington, a king minus a crown, was an inhuman monarch, odious as the crowned skulls of Europe. I seen the white derelicts licking caviar out of dumpsters, the pig-faced whores civil as doubles, the homeless waifs bidding down on cardboard outside the burnt shell of the brick-torched Congress. Gunshots outnumber flu shots, snatch. Gunshots outnumber flu shots, snatch. Guns are more plentiful and beloved than be the Bible. Even priests brandish outlandish cannons here. White marble, chocolate city, center of orgies of centaurs and nuns, snuffling and scuffling in bed each midnight. Here faith is always going down grade, for evil can't be rinsed away unlike watercolors. Here, cannibalism is synonymous with candor. I see my bushman's blood gush red into black type, my caste, C-A-S-T, C-A-S-T-E, my ruthless dye. My problem is I recall the phantom slaves, that touch of smoke upon the Potomac, that historians paper over with guilt, My brittle treble troubles the resonant glaze of ink, but you need dark yellow tequila and a brazen brass trumpet to wipe away piss yellow journalism. Civilization is exacting, but America is only merely play acting at civility. And that's my 10 minutes. Thanks very much.
I think I dibs on the book if someone else doesn't get it.
Only $20.
I love the 5 cents a page. You can't do better. It is now a great honor to welcome John Clarke. We've got lots of Clarkes here today. A longtime organizer with OCAP. Many of you will know him well from that work and other work in this city. John was also the Packer Visitor in Social Justice. He currently facilitates Fighting to Win, a course for union and community activists run with the support of the Leo Panish School. Thank you and welcome, John.
So thanks very much. As someone who's mainly been involved in movement building and struggles, I tend to examine things from that perspective. And so I must say, in reading the 3 volumes, I got a great deal of hope in that regard. I think it had something to say about the struggles that we engage in and what needs to be taken up and the way forward. I don't think it's a very profound or original observation to point out that Canada as a capitalist society is also a project of colonial dispossession. But unfortunately that often just gets said as a kind of a prelude or as an afterthought. But what we've got here with these 3 volumes is a really systematic and detailed explanation of how that has actually unfolded over the years. And that's something that's really, really important. It's important in terms of our understanding, but it's important as well in terms of how we fight back and how we organise in the face of the situation. So I found it a very, very valuable experience to read those 3 volumes. I think that what we see is a charting of, in detail, the development of Canada as a capitalist society. We see from the early stages when capital is being accumulated and the foundations for a capitalist society are being laid, right through to the present period of what I think Bryan calls crisis capitalism that we're now dealing with. And so as that has developed, we see at the same time, and it's charted in detail, the strategies of containment that have been put in place to certainly control workers and working class struggles, but to control and suppress indigenous resistance as well. And there has been a detailed, very, very systematic attempts to ensure that the needs of capital that the indigenous people are subordinated to the needs of capital as it develops at different times. From military alliances and the fur trade, through the reserve system, residential schools, incarceration, through to Justin Trudeau with his handkerchief out in the House of Commons. All of those things, in one way or another, are attempts to contain the possibility of indigenous resistance. And this book gives you a real clear understanding of how that process has unfolded. What we see in the book is a systematic process of containment that has shifted over the years according to the needs of capital. I hesitate to use Patrick Wolf as a source because I know Bryan and I have talked about that, but I must say I do see the logic of elimination at work in the book. I do see that process of containment and how it's worked out and how brutal it's been. And at the same time, the book charts in considerable detail the process of subjugating, controlling and exploiting the working class and all the different strategies that have been taken up along the path of doing that. And it charts, of course, evidence of resistance, the fight back that's been taken up by workers, been taken up by indigenous communities, because this is a society, whether we're talking about its capitalist face or its colonialist face, this is a society that breeds at every turn the necessity of resistance and people fighting back. And we see lots of evidence of that throughout the book. But Bryan gives, I think, a very honest assessment of the difficulties that have faced a working class struggle. the limitations that have been imposed on trade unions, the present weakness of trade unions and all those things. And he gives some really inspiring examples of how, in some ways, indigenous resistance has led the way. Some very, very, very important struggles that have been taken up that we can all look to with great respect and admiration, but that we can learn a lot from. But as he explains in the book, those processes have tended to be parallel, not to be integrated as they should be. There's been glimpses, of the possibilities, but generally speaking, there hasn't been that bringing together of the anti-colonial struggle and working class resistance. And we're all the poorer for that, I must say. But it is the reality. But he poses some really, really interesting glimpses of possibility that have emerged over the years. And he pays particular attention to the 1960s, a decade that Bryan has paid a lot of attention to anyway. But he looks at how some of those movements started to come together. I must say, in the work that we did on the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, we saw some of those glimpses too. We saw some of those possibilities. We saw the ways in which Indigenous struggles and the struggles of people, of non-Indigenous people, of settler people, can be combined and organised together. The working relationship we had with the Mohawks of Tyendinaga, for example, and the ways in which we supported each other's actions very, very concretely was a really compelling example of what I'm talking about. But today, and this is how I really want to try to bring things together in terms of my assessment, today there is a renewed sense of possibility with regards to fusing working class struggle and Indigenous resistance. I think that's very, very true, and I like the idea of Carney being somebody who puts on a carnival, because we're getting quite an incredible carnival at the moment. We're seeing such a rounded form of attack, such a comprehensive form of attack. Austerity measures, attacks on trade unions, attacks on communities, attacks on the environment, but also a frontal assault on Indigenous rights. That's going to be a very, very major part of what is happening, and it's already happening. And we're seeing stirrings, we're seeing the people who hold official positions saying the right things, but I know very well that there is going to be burning indignation within Indigenous communities. There's going to be a desire to resist, there's going to be a fight back that's going to occur. And that fight back is going to be infectious. Indigenous resistance isn't some token thing in this country. We have the legacy of Oka. We have the land defenders, the Wet'suwet'en land defenders, who sparked a confrontation across this country that saw ships backed out into the Pacific, the Mohawk Tyendinagas blocking rail lines. We saw a real crisis for the Canadian state. When Trudeau cried on that occasion, he really meant it. They were really good and scared. And there was enormous possibilities that were raised. Today, what's coming down from crisis capitalism is indeed a very, very major attack. And the possibility of combining the struggle against capitalism and the struggle against colonialism is, I think, reaching a very, very high level. Which is why I think this book is so valuable, why I think it comes out at exactly the right time. I would say that I'm sort of guessing that the anti-capitalist perspective is fairly well represented in this room. So I imagine that there is going to be a lot of support for the idea of fighting back against what the capitalist system is trying to do to us. But at the same time, we need to remember that the struggle against capitalism in Canada can only be a struggle against colonialism. And those two things have to merge, they have to be part of the same fight, and they have to become absolutely unstoppable. And thanks to Bryan Palmer for this book.
Yes.
Okay, so last but certainly not least, I'm so thrilled to welcome the belle of our ball tonight, Bryan Palmer. Bryan hardly needs introduction in probably most spaces I go, but in this room of fans and friends, certainly not. Just in case you weren't aware, Bryan is Professor Emeritus at Trent University and author and editor of such a long list of essential readings on labor, capitalist, and colonial history, and many other topics. I could go on, but our time is better spent hearing Bryan go on about this project that goes on, as you've heard, for 3 volumes. Please warmly welcome Bryan Palmer.
Well, thank you very much. I am not even going to take 10 minutes, I don't think. It was really an honor for me to give the inaugural lecture at the Leo Panitch School for Education. a few years ago where I lectured on this actual topic of colonialism, capitalism in Canada. And now to have the school host this event for the books that I've written, I'm very grateful. I want to thank Matt, but all the people who work with the school, and I want to thank, of course, Leo for being what he was over so many years. I mean, many people here have connections with him. And, what he did was monumental, and he helped to put Canada and a radical perspective on Canada and on global events very much to the forefront. So I'm very grateful to Leo, to the school, and I'm very grateful to the panelists here tonight. I want to thank Deb for chairing and introducing, and Russ for giving us his perspective on Indian struggles and Canada. George for his poetry and his panache, and John for, in a sense, tying up, in some senses better than I could, what the books were really about. What the books, I should speak maybe a bit about the origins of the book. And they come out of my teaching at Trent, which, Russ mentioned he had been there years ago. And my last teaching at Trent was a course in the Frost Center for Canadian and Indigenous Studies. And the students were perfectly willing to accept and acknowledge that Canada was a colonial project, and that it had always been a colonial project, and it certainly was a colonial project now. But they were incredulous that capitalism should be introduced into the same coupling. They simply did not accept that. And for me, this was in fact incredulous, that somehow these two basic foundational structures of Canadian being could be divorced. So what I really wanted to do in writing these books was to try to actually bring together the history of Canada as a history of colonial and capitalist exploitation and oppression. And which came first is kind of a chicken and an egg question at this point, because at this point there is no, I think, discernible differentiation between the capitalist project and the colonial project. They are as one. In spite of the fact that, as Russ pointed out, and as I think all people on the panel would agree and everyone in this room might accept, the Canadian state has been very adroit at basically offering a rhetoric of recognition, reconciliation, while the fundamental material oppression of colonialism and the continuities in the colonial and capitalist coupling are very much evident in everyday life. And I really wanted to try to put forward a perspective which I think the bringing down of colonialism will only happen with the bringing down of capitalism, and the bringing down of capitalism will only happen with confronting and bringing down colonialism as well. And in this sense, as John pointed out, the tragedy that I wanted to try to elaborate for us, those on the Canadian left, is that the movements against colonialism that are often, have often been led by Indigenous peoples, and the movements that have the potential to be anti-capitalist, which are often led by workers and radicals. These movements have existed throughout history, but they exist in some senses separate from one another. Now, there have been far-seeing elements and peoples at particular moments that saw the necessity of bringing these two struggles together. But our history is one of distinct separations. And that is the legacy, the tragic legacy that we live with. Because until these struggles against capitalism and colonialism become one, and each one is necessarily enfeebled and rendered far less likely of any success. And that tragedy goes back in Canadian history to many centuries, but a point I'll end with is the tragedy of the 1880s, when this was very apparent. You had at that moment with the consolidation of industrial capitalism, the rise of workers and the early beginnings and nascent beginnings of the socialist movement. You had opposition that spread across the country, from the Provincial Workmen's Association lodges in the Maritimes to the Knights of Labor, strongest in Quebec and Ontario, trade union centrals that began and fought major struggles for the 9-hour day. All of this happened throughout the 1870s and 1880s. And it was called the Great Upheaval. There was a labor mobilization that people like John A. Macdonald thought challenged capitalism and the early Canadian state. And the peak of that was in 1885 and 86. At the very moment that in the so-called Northwest, in the old Rupert's Land, there was a rising of Métis and Indigenous peoples, an armed war of resistance against capitalism and colonialism. And yet those two movements never really fused into a potential assault on the foundations of power and inequality as they were registering in Canada. That is the legacy that the left has lived with in this country. A separation of the struggles that need to be brought together. And in a sense, if there was a very modest proposal that these 3 volumes are all about, it's the necessity to help the project of creating the kind of intelligentsia that George talked about and referred to, that would be aware of the necessity of bringing these divergent elements together. So I want to thank everybody on the panel very much. It's really an honor to have these people speak about one's work and to address it. And to thank all of you for coming, and I hope you can have a drink, talk among yourselves, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Okay, before we start talking and drinking and looking back into each other's eyes, we do have some important time, which is for questions, comments, brief comments.
Yes, there is in the volume a discussion of the Chinese role and fundamental role in doing the labor that went into the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. So that is there, along with an appreciation of the exactly the issues you mentioned, the very dangerous work, the number of Chinese laborers who died, many of them simply buried in tunnel explosions without, proper graves or even acknowledgement of their deaths. And there is a discussion as well of the labor in general, the labor movement's pretty sordid approach to Chinese immigration. And the Knights of Labor, who in general had a better approach to race than many other craft unions affiliated with the American Federation of Labor. But the Knights of Labor did, and they were split. There were those in the Knights of Labor, more far-seeing, more socialist inclined types, who defended the Chinese. But the bulk of the orientation of the Knights of Labor was towards the exclusion of Chinese labor. And that carried over to the labor movement of the 20th century, when there was support for again, immigration restriction, not just of Chinese peoples, but of all kinds of immigrants to Canada. Capital and the state wanted these laborers, but then also, as soon as their labor in building the CPR was actually completed, they fomented a great deal of racist animosity as well. So the history of all Asian workers really is fraught with racial animosities that are certainly a stain on the country, but also on segments of the workers' movement as well. So that is in the book very definitely. it's there. And the riots, anti-Asiatic riots that occurred in British Columbia, for instance, in 1907, are discussed in a chapter called White Canada Forever, which was the slogan of, by that point, a mobilization to resist and exclude certain peoples from immigrating to Canada that was fomented by politicians and elites and large capitalist interests. When I wrote the books, I did pitch to Lorimer quite explicitly, do you want me to address questions like settler colonialism? He said, no, don't. He wanted books that would be accessible, readable, sold in chapters in indigo, and his view was that that mass audience was not interested in these finer theoretical points on the left of, quote, settler colonialism. Now, I agreed, not out of being cowed by him, but because I thought, and still think, that if you're going to use a term like settler colonialism, and Canada in the international theoretical literature is often put forward as a kind of poster child for settler colonialism, by writers like Patrick Wolfe and Veracini and others who actually know very little about Canada as far as I can determine. So the problem for me, and I just spent an afternoon discussing this with some people in the Socialist Project. First of all, what settler colonialism as a paradigm has done is pushed all of us who are non-Indigenous to address colonial dispossession and the realities of Indigenous experience in Canada. And that is a very positive thing. It's a plus. And I don't want to underestimate that. What I would say about writing on settler colonialism in Canada, however, is that the term has been utilized with very little engagement with that theoretical literature. And very little engagement and critical encountering of some of what I consider the problems to be. And in a very basic way, it seems to me, and this is, I'm perfectly willing to say that it's open to debate, but the very term settler colonialism is problematized from a Marxist vantage point because it homogenizes all settlers. And it homogenizes the responsibilities for colonial dispossession. And before settler colonialism became a term of common currency, if you'd have asked people on the left 50 years ago, which for some of us is a recollection, not antiquity. If you'd have asked them who's more responsible for Indigenous dispossession, the Ukrainian homesteader 50 kilometers outside of Brandon, or the Canadian Pacific Railroad, and Johnny MacDonald and the state that served the interests of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, every leftist would have answered that question very clearly. Now,
how would they have answered? What would they have said?
They would have said it's the CPR and the state.
Okay.
Very clearly. I mean, now, what settler colonialism has done is alerted us to broader patterns. And I think people can read these 3 volumes, by the way, and they can actually say, okay, they prove that settler colonialism is a legitimate way of looking at Canada. Or they might say, okay, it's more of a problematized term for me. There's a conceptualization there. Empirically, now, and when I say it's un-Marxian, I mean it obliterates, in my view, that may be too strong a term, but I'll use it. It obliterates class division and distinction, and tends to elide over the incredible role of the state and state power, which is also, of course, inevitably a class, issue. Okay, there's that. So that's the conceptual issue. But Marxist tradition is not necessarily right on everything. Empirically, if you look at the long history of Canada, there are periods when settler colonialism, to me, does not seem to have a lot of salience. The entire fur trade era, from 1500 to roughly 1800, which I believe indigenous people would locate as a central moment historically in their colonization and dispossession, was not so much about settler colonialism. I mean, as Russ pointed out, indigenous peoples had some power and authority in this moment. They were military allies with empires conflicting over who was going to control the landmass now known as North America. And without those indigenous allies, they would not have actually, those empires would not have been able to sustain successful struggles against their opponents. You know, and this is brought home just decisively. If you look at the role of indigenous peoples in the War of 1812, they are recognized as heroic fighters on the side of the British that defeated the Americans. If you look at the role of indigenous warriors in the rebellions of 1837, where they were often again allied with the loyalist side in suppressing the rebellious uprisings, it's at that moment that the Crown, the British Colonial Office, says, we don't want these people fighting on our side. We don't want, quote, savages. Before, they are heroic warriors fighting on the side of empire. 20 years later, they're dismissed as savages who, even though the Americans who are aligned with often the radicals, and we don't want them defeating Americans coming across the border to actually fight on the side of the rebels. Why? Because this is part of the economic differentiation that moves Canada out of a fur trade kind of staples economy into the beginnings of an industrial capitalist order. It's not yet arrived, but it's coming. So if you look at that, and also if you jump forward to the 1950s and the relocations of Inuit people in the north, is this really about settler colonialism? Or is it not really about the state and capital and resource extraction? And that had an incredibly debilitating from the 30s into the very early 60s. You know, Farley Mowat writes about this. I have some criticism of what he says, but there's no question that the discombobulation of those, removals of Inuit peoples from their traditional, hunting lands was just incredibly destructive. There's all that, and then it comes down to, so there's a conceptual issue, there's an empirical, historical issue, and then there's a political issue. And here is where there's, I think, a great deal of contention. But my view would be, if we want to build a socialist project that brings together those two streams that I have argued in the book have historically and tragically been separate. That is, the potentially anti-capitalist struggles led by workers' movements and socialists, and the anti-colonial struggles often led by indigenous peoples, some of whom, by the way, like the 1.5 men, quote unquote, in Saskatchewan and Alberta, Métis militants, were communist and CCF advocates. If you want to bring those streams together, is settler colonialism a way to do that? And I've been wrestling with that and wondering about it. And my conclusion is that I prefer the nouns, not the adjectives. The struggle, in my view, is against colonialism and capitalism. And I think that's... Now, it does not mean that, because where are we in our struggle right now? The whole left needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. The trade union movement has been decimated. Just compare, if you want to even look at what the labor bureaucracy was doing in the 1980s in its struggle against free trade. I mean, it lost that battle, but at least it fought on some level. Where are the fights of the established, trade union leadership now? They basically conceded to Carney and the liberals, the fight against, Trump's agenda. So I think settler colonialism educates people, it pushes people to acknowledge indigenous dispossession, to address, as John said, the horrors and the brutalities, at times genocidal acts that have been part of Canadian history. But, to counter something, or to, not counter, but to complicate what John said about the elimination of the native. This is Patrick Wolf's phrase. I think you raised that, right? And you see that in the book. And there are elements of that in the book. But one thing that settler colonialism is premised on, according to Wolf, is that the elimination of the native doesn't just happen through genocide and through violence. He cites the instance of intermarriage and says this is the elimination of the native too. Well, do we want to say to Métis people in Canada? Do we want to say to Métis people in Canada, your very being is not only proof of settler colonialism, but it has been part of the project of eliminating indigeneity in the native. I'm not sure that people who consider themselves part of a Métis nation would take very kindly to that. I suppose where I'm coming down on the issue is in what I see in the settler colonial, which is almost like a, as I said, and in the way it's been adapted in Canada, the adaptation, it seems to me it does elide the responsibility of the state and powerful, class interests. And in doing so, it homogenizes a settler experience and responsibility. That's really my main point. But you're absolutely right. It is not mutually exclusive that a policy on settlement would actually further capital's interests and dispossession. That's absolutely true. A part of this reason, I think, for a student disinclination to see capitalism as centrally, as embedded in colonialism and vice versa, and the reciprocity of these two foundational structures of Canadian being. A part of it is the extent to which the colonial legacy has been, as Russ pointed out, quite effectively, rhetorically at least, displaced by the state in its, in its recognition of sovereignty, but of course, non-recognition in reality of sovereign claims. Its rhetoric of reconciliation when the drinking water issue hasn't even been resolved, let alone issues of land and a whole set of other issues. And so, the state in Canada, compared to the state in the United States, has been far more adroit at massaging and lessening, at massaging the colonial, realities. And so young students who are progressive pick up on that, and in some senses they turn that around. They say, well, we've got to address that. But capitalism is something that they think they do not necessarily see as exploitative. There's so much of the ideological apparatus of the time that promotes capitalism as a meritocracy, that promotes capitalism as promoting affluence, we know this to be untrue, we know this is a lie, but the ideological weight which obscures capitalism's fundamentally exploitative and oppressive character, and its inherent crises. It's the fact that it is the acceleration of the calendar of crises has normalized crises for a lot of these young people. I mean, since 1975 to the present, I mean, there has been no period of longevity of you know, affluence. It's just been a series of ups and downs. And young people have acclimatized to that and accepted it to some extent as normal, in part because the left has been obliterated and it has not been a presence in terms of, you know, countering.
I just wanted to make one other point. You notice I didn't use the term settler colonialism in my talk. I said Canada's a white supremacist settler state.
Yeah.
And it's based on this two founding nations, you know, the French and English concept. They were the ones who were in Charlottetown negotiating with England the terms of the B&A Act. You know, Indians weren't there.
Yeah.
And in 1980, when Pierre Trudeau, you know, started negotiating the new constitution, it was Saul Sanderson out of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations who came up with the term First Nations. He said, we are the First Nations, in order to counter the two founding nations. That's where First Nations came from. Nobody talks about that. And it was meant to be a nation, like the Cree Nation, not a band.
Right.
But everybody took on, you know, First Nation and added the name to their band and used an indigenous name to say they were, you know, an indigenous, whatever the indigenous name is, First Nation. I just wanted to make that point because my perspective is I've read some of the literature about settler colonialism. I understand it. Some of the academics I know use the term. But my perspective, and I come from Native studies, my perspective is Canada's a settler state. It's a white supremacist settler state. And it's, you know, this new it's embedded in Canada's constitution. Like I said, Quebec and the rest of Canada, the province of Quebec, they never made treaties, right? And they were accommodated by the state. They were part of the state after conquest. And so you see the problems today with Quebec denying Indigenous rights. No systemic racism in Quebec. You know, that woman died in the hospital, you know. Throwing rocks at people from my reserve, you know, during 1990. And the guy that got hit with a rock and died, he was French-Canadian who had married into my community, you know. So I don't use the term settler colonialism, I use the term settler state because I think it reflects the constitutional framework that we have to deal with. Like South Africa, apartheid. You know, you talk about how come we didn't come together. Well, because Canada's an apartheid state. It's the Indian Act, it's Section 9124, it's Section 35, the way they interpret, you know, the recognition of Aboriginal treaty rights. So we're not going to see, you know, coming together until, and I think there's, you know, the racism or ethnocentrism amongst the left, you know. I think that answers the question about colonialism versus capitalism. They don't want to look at the mirror and see, you know, how they might be descended from families who benefit. Because that's what my friend, I'll just end with this. My friend, the Art Manuel, before he passed, he was talking about the Dalgamuk decision, which recognized Aboriginal title, and that his point was that the Supreme Court finally recognized there's a proprietary interest in the land in the Dalgamuk decision. And he was taking that, literally taking that decision and going to meet with Moody's and that, bond rating agencies, and saying, there's a contingent liability that Canada has that they haven't addressed because they're not recognizing Aboriginal title. He got into the softwood lumber debate, the first one, on the American side, and said, yes, dimensional lumber paper coming from Canada into the States doesn't reflect any benefit to the Aboriginal title nations or to the historic treaty nations. Therefore, they're able to sell that product cheaper, so it constitutes an unfair trade subsidy, you know, our proprietary interest in the land. Art was, you know, ahead of his time on that. I haven't seen any leaders pick up on that ever since Art's passed. some economists. He was working with Bill Clinton's economist Stiglitz on macroeconomic analysis of Aboriginal title. And they used Stiglitz as an expert witness in the Restow case on the annuities for the Robinson-Huron Treaty. They brought him in to talk about how much the resources were that were taken out of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And that's kind of how they came up with the basis of sawing it off at 10 billion, 5 billion for Ontario and 5 billion for Canada. So my analysis is it's a settler state, it's a white supremacist settler state, it's the way they interpret Section 35 of the Constitution. I don't really, I can see the settler colonialism concept academically, but in reality, I'm dealing with a settler state, and it's a racist one. And it tries to, come off as progressive and seeking justice, but it's not. And your book covers that pretty good.
In a sense, I think that the project has been sold, and it seems to me that a critical point was the 1969 white paper, where red power elements challenged that and refused that. Up to that point, the entire history of the 19th and 20th centuries, the state policy could be summed up in terms of coercive assimilation. They could no longer, after the white paper was defeated, embrace and publicly proclaim coercive assimilation. So they moved on to a different terrain of recognition, reconciliation. But they changed nothing in terms of the material.
Like self-government, they co-opted that.
Yeah. So in some senses, the answer, how do they sell the project, is that they in some senses massage in various ways the colonial realities, and they trump, or I'm using the word advisedly, the capitalist realities. So when Trump actually posed a threat seemingly to Canadian capitalism, all the reconciliation rhetoric went out the window. All the notion that you have a duty to consult, as vague and as vacuous as that was, went out the window. And now they passed legislation, Ford did it in Ontario, the Ring of Fire could be developed. Carney's done it in a much larger way with any infrastructure project or development project that is in the interests of Canada, which they define, simply overrides all the rhetoric about self-government and duty to consult and land entitlements, etc. So they have again, it's about the entwinement of capitalism and colonialism, but the ideological apparatus that they can mount treats these two determining structures, it seems to me, very differently.
Great. Do you have any final thoughts there, Deb?
I think in the interest of time, I'll hold them. Yeah.
You'll hold them?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe to just wrap us up, can we please give a big round of applause to our whole panel?